The Pacific Ocean was a monstrous, breathing entity of cold, grey steel, its breath a constant mist that clung to the transport ship like a shroud. Inside the vessel's belly, huddled in the damp and the dark, were the women of the Imperial Chrysanthemum Division. They were not prisoners in the conventional sense, not yet. They were warriors, the distilled essence of a divine mission, momentarily inconvenienced by the fortunes of war. Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka, her back ramrod straight, even as she sat on the hard metal floor, felt the rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines through her bones. It was a funereal drumbeat, counting down the moments to their final test. For weeks they had been fed a diet of cold rice, thinner than water soup, and the unyielding iron of their ideology. They were the steel blossoms of the empire, forged in the fires of sacrifice, and they knew what awaited them at the hands of the Americans. Their training had been explicit, their indoctrination absolute. The enemy, the Gaijin, were depicted as a clumsy, brutish monolith. They were soft, decadent capitalists on one hand, and sadistic, inhuman monsters on the other. The propaganda posters that had papered the walls of their barracks showed leering American soldiers with ape-like features, their hands dripping with the blood of the innocent. They had been told stories of torture, of unspeakable violations, of a cruelty born not of strength, but of a profound spiritual sickness. Capture was the ultimate dishonor, a fate worse than death. But their unit had been overrun, their position made untenable. They had fought until the last bullet, until their rifles were useless clubs and their hands were raw. They had failed to die an honorable death in battle, and so this was their penance, to face the final degradation at the hands of the barbarians. Akiko closed her eyes, her mind a fortress. She and her women would show them how the daughters of Yamato faced their end. They would not scream, they would not beg. They would meet the enemy's barbarism with a silence so profound it would haunt them. The expectation was a physical weight in the churning gut of the ship. Each woman carried it differently. Some chanted sutras under their breath, their lips barely moving. Others sharpened slivers of wood or metal, anything that could serve as a final weapon of defiance or self-immolation. They spoke little, their communication a series of sharp glances and imperceptible nods. They were a single organism, a collective will, pointed toward a shared, grim destiny. They envisioned muddy, disease-ridden camps, barbed wire cages open to the elements. They expected starvation rations, just enough to keep them alive for interrogation. They anticipated the casual brutality of guards who saw them not as soldiers, but as subhuman curiosities. This was the logical endpoint of their war, the final chapter of their story as they had been taught it. The world was a crucible, and only the purest, strongest spirit would endure. Theirs was that spirit. The Americans, with their material wealth and spiritual poverty, were an aberration, a historical mistake that would soon be corrected. Their capture was not a defeat for their ideology, but a chance to prove its supremacy in the face of the ultimate trial. They had been preparing for hell, but the reality that awaited them was something far more insidious and confusing. If you are captivated by this descent into the heart of a forgotten conflict, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Their first sight of America was not the squalor they had imagined, but the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Arizona desert. The air was thin and so dry it felt sharp in their lungs, a stark contrast to the humid, cloying air of the islands they had left behind. They were marched from the train, their hands bound, their eyes scanning the horizon for the hellscape they knew was coming. They saw a camp, yes, but it was not the pit of despair from the propaganda reels. It was a sprawling, orderly city of wooden barracks laid out in a precise grid under a sky of impossible blue. The dust that kicked up from the guards' boots was a fine, reddish powder, but there was no mud, no filth. The fences were tall and topped with barbed wire, certainly, but they enclosed a space that was clean, organized, and strangely peaceful. An American officer, a man with tired eyes and a face tanned to leather, greeted them not with a snarling tirade, but with a clipped professional monotone, his words translated by a nervous-looking Nisei interpreter. The women were processed with a chilling efficiency. They were stripped of their tattered uniforms, herded into a building that smelled of antiseptic soap, and forced under streams of shockingly hot water. It was the first truly hot water most of them had felt in years, a luxury so profound it felt like a violation. They were scrubbed down by stern-faced female medics who handled them not with cruelty or leering curiosity, but with a brusque, impersonal thoroughness, checking them for lice and wounds with practiced hands. Then came another shock, the clothes. They were not given rags or humiliating sacks. They were issued simple but clean and sturdy cotton shifts, undergarments, and thick wool blankets. The fabric was rough but new. The blankets were heavy and smelled of mothballs, not mold. Akiko ran her fingers over the coarse weave, her mind reeling. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. This was a prelude to a more sophisticated form of torture, a psychological game designed to soften them, to make them pliable before the real suffering began. The first meal was the ultimate confirmation of their suspicions. They were led into a long hall, a mess hall, and seated at clean wooden tables. Down the line came American soldiers, slopping food onto metal trays with an air of profound boredom. Akiko stared at her tray, her stomach tightening with a mixture of hunger and dread. There was a piece of meat. She thought it might be beef, swimming in a thick brown gravy. A scoop of mashed potatoes, white and fluffy. A serving of green beans, a slice of bread, and a tin cup of dark, steaming liquid that smelled bitter and strong. Coffee. It was a feast beyond imagining. Back on the front, a meal like this would have been reserved for a high general celebrating a major victory. The women looked at each other, their faces masks of suspicion. No one ate. They were certain the food was poisoned. They would starve before they would allow the enemy this final, easy victory. They sat in rigid silence, a united front of defiance, waiting for the guards to force them. But the guards just watched, their expressions unreadable, and after a while they simply took the full trays away. The performance was repeated the next day, and the day after that. The same clean barracks, the same hot water, the same impossible food. And still the women resisted, but hunger is a patient, insidious predator. By the fourth day, the gnawing emptiness in their bellies began to erode the foundations of their discipline. One of the younger girls, her face pale and drawn, finally broke. With a shaking hand, she lifted a piece of bread to her lips and took a small, tentative bite. All eyes were on her. They watched her chew, swallow, and wait. They waited for the convulsions, for the scream of agony. Nothing happened. The girl took another bite, then another, her movements becoming more frantic, until she was wolfing down the food, with tears streaming down her face. One by one, like a collapsing wall of stones, the others followed. Akiko was one of the last. The shame of her surrender was a bitter taste in her mouth, but the warmth of the gravy, the simple, honest flavor of the potatoes, was a revelation that shook her to her very core. This was not poison for the body. This, she began to realize, was a much more dangerous poison for the soul. What kind of power allows an army to feed its prisoners better than it feeds its own soldiers? Join us as we unravel this mystery by hitting the like button and sharing this video with fellow history enthusiasts. The days bled into weeks, and the routine of the camp became a disorienting new reality. The initial suspicion that this was all an elaborate ruse began to fray at the edges, worn thin by the relentless, monotonous consistency of the Americans' behavior. There was no sudden shift, no moment where the mask was dropped to reveal the snarling monster beneath. The guards performed their duties with a kind of detached professionalism that was more unnerving than open hostility. They were not friends, but they were not tormentors either. They were simply wardens. They enforced the rules, counted the prisoners, and oversaw the daily schedules with an efficiency that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. Akiko watched them, studied them, searching for the cracks in their facade. She saw none. She saw young men who chewed gum, read letters from home, and complained about the food, the same food that she and her women now ate with a mixture of gratitude and shame. The cognitive dissonance began to set in, a creeping fog of confusion that clouded the certainties they had held so dear. The world, as they understood it, had been turned upside down. They were soldiers of a divine empire, a race of supreme spirit and unbreakable will. The Americans were supposed to be weak, decadent, and spiritually bankrupt. Yet it was the Americans who had the resources to build these clean, orderly camps in the middle of a desert. It was the Americans who had an endless supply of food, medicine, and warm blankets to spare, even for their most hated enemies. Every morning, Akiko would watch the supply trucks roll in, kicking up clouds of red dust. They were loaded with crates of canned goods, sacks of flour and potatoes, and sides of beef. The sheer casual abundance of it all was an assault on her senses. She began to have memories, sharp and painful, of her own men on the front lines, their bodies gaunt, their eyes hollowed out by hunger, fighting over a handful of stale rice. The camp was a microcosm of this baffling new world. There were other prisoners, tall, blonde Germans who sang mournful songs in the evenings, and dark-haired, boisterous Italians who gesticulated wildly as they spoke. Akiko and her women observed them from a distance, and they saw that these other prisoners, these European allies who had also been defeated, were treated in exactly the same way. They received the same food, the same medical care, the same clean barracks. This was the most devastating realization of all. The good treatment was not a special psychological tactic designed for them. They were not special. This was simply the American system. It was their standard operating procedure. The thought was terrifying. It suggested a power so vast, so deeply ingrained in the fabric of their enemy's society, that they could afford to be humane out of sheer, unthinking habit. Their own ideology was built on the principle of scarcity, of stealing the spirit through deprivation. The enemy's ideology, it seemed, was built on a foundation of such overwhelming plenty that they didn't even have to consider the alternative. One afternoon, a woman in her platoon, Emmy, collapsed during the daily roll call. She had been hiding a fever for days, terrified that showing weakness would result in being taken away and killed. Instead, she was carried by 2 American medics to the camp infirmary. Akiko expected never to see her again, but 3 days later Emmy returned. She was pale, but her fever was gone. She spoke in a hushed, awed whisper about the infirmary. A clean bed with white sheets, a doctor who had examined her wound, which had become infected, with gentle, skilled hands. He had given her a shot of a new medicine, penicillin she called it, and he had spoken to her through the Nisei interpreter, not as a prisoner, but as a patient. He had asked her about her pain. He had told her she would be all right. Emmy cried as she told the story, not from pain or fear, but from a confusion so profound it had broken her. To be treated with such decency by the enemy was a more profound violation of her worldview than any act of brutality could ever have been. If this exploration of the psychological front lines of war resonates with you, help our channel grow by leaving a comment below. What aspect of this story surprises you the most? The daily routine became a series of small, accumulating psychological blows. It wasn't the grand gestures, but the mundane details that did the most damage to their carefully constructed reality. It was the soap. Each woman was issued a small, personal bar of soap. It was coarse and smelled vaguely of lye, but it lathered richly. When it was used up, it was replaced. The idea of personal, disposable soap was an alien concept. In the field, soap was a communal, precious resource, a sliver of which was shared among a dozen soldiers until it dissolved into nothing. Here, it was treated as a basic, unremarkable necessity, as common as the dust under their feet. It spoke of a world where cleanliness was not a luxury, but an assumption. It was a small, quiet symbol of a civilization that had mastered the material world to a degree they could barely comprehend. Then there was the waste. After every meal, the prisoners would scrape the leftovers from their trays into large garbage cans. Akiko watched in silent, horrified fascination. Scraps of bread, half-eaten potatoes, spoonfuls of gravy, enough food to keep a family alive for a day back home, was unceremoniously dumped and carted away. Her mind, conditioned by years of scarcity and the doctrine of mottainai, a deep-seated regret concerning waste, could not process the sight. It felt like a sacrilege. Her first instinct was to feel contempt for this decadent, wasteful culture. But a colder, more honest feeling quickly replaced it, a deep, corrosive envy. What kind of nation could afford to throw away this much food in the middle of a global war while feeding its captive enemies? It was a display of power more intimidating than any battleship or bomber. The comparison between their past and their present became a constant, tormenting internal monologue for Akiko and her women. They remembered the feel of their own army-issued boots, the thin leather worn through to the soles, stuffed with newspaper to keep out the damp. And they saw the American Guards' boots, thick, sturdy, and well-oiled, their treads deep and unworn. They remembered their threadbare blankets, which did little to ward off the bone-deep chill of a jungle night. And they slept now under heavy wool blankets that were so warm they often had to push them off in the middle of the night. Every object, every interaction was a testament to the chasm that separated their two worlds. Their own nation demanded spiritual purity and sacrifice because it had little else to offer. America, it seemed, demanded very little of its soldiers' spirits because it could provide for their bodies in overwhelming abundance. The psychological toll was immense. The strict hierarchy and discipline that had defined their unit began to fray. The women grew quieter, more withdrawn. The shared certainty that had once bound them together was replaced by a shared, unspoken confusion. They had been taught that suffering forged the spirit, that deprivation was the path to strength. But here they were, in a state of relative comfort, and they felt weaker and more lost than ever before. Their sense of identity had been predicated on their superiority, their unique ability to endure hardship. Now faced with an enemy that seemed to have eliminated hardship as a basic condition of life, that identity was crumbling. They were forced to confront a terrifying possibility that their entire philosophy, the very bedrock of their existence, was not a sign of strength, but a justification for poverty. It was the grand, beautiful lie told by a nation that could not afford to give its people soap. The true war, Akiko realized, was not being fought with guns and steel. It was being fought with bread, with medicine, with blankets. And in this war, they had been defeated before they had even begun to fight. This deep dive into the clash of cultures is made possible by viewers like you. If you appreciate this kind of detailed historical storytelling, please consider supporting us by hitting the subscribe button. As the desert sun weakened, and a distinct chill began to settle over the plains at night, a strange new word entered the camp's vocabulary: Thanksgiving. The prisoners heard the guards talking about it, a sense of anticipation in their voices. They spoke of travel, of family, of a great feast. To Akiko and the other Japanese women, it was just another incomprehensible American ritual, a piece of cultural noise they registered but did not understand. They assumed it would be a day like any other, perhaps one where the guards were more distracted or more irritable, homesick for their faraway families. They had no context for a holiday built around the concept of gratitude for abundance. In their world, gratitude was reserved for the emperor, for the honor of being allowed to die in his name. The idea of being thankful for something as mundane as a good harvest seemed childish, a luxury of a people who had never known true hunger. The date was Thursday, November 23rd, 1944. The morning began as usual with the shrill blast of the whistle for roll call. The air was crisp and cold, but as the women were marched toward the mess hall for their midday meal, they noticed something was different. A new smell hung in the air, a complex and savory aroma that was entirely unfamiliar. It was rich and warm, a mixture of roasting meat, strange herbs, and something sweet, like baked fruit and spices. There was a buzz of activity around the mess hall. Extra tables had been set up, and the bored, sullen soldiers who usually served the food were replaced by a larger group, including some of the camp's administrative officers, who were all wearing cleaner uniforms and an air of forced cheerfulness. Inside, the mess hall had been transformed. It was still a stark, functional room, but there were crude, handmade decorations on the walls, paper cutouts of pilgrims and large orange gourds, and the food. The food was laid out on the serving line in shocking, impossible mountains. There were huge, glistening roasted turkeys, their skins brown and crackling. There were deep pans of stuffing, mashed potatoes swimming in pools of melted butter, and a bright, jewel-toned red sauce that they would later learn was made from cranberries. There were bowls of green beans, sweet potatoes, topped with melted marshmallows, and endless baskets of soft bread rolls. And for dessert there were rows upon rows of pies, pumpkin, apple, pecan, their scents mingling to create an intoxicating perfume of sugar and spice. It was not just a meal, it was a work of art, a defiant and overwhelming display of culinary power. The German and Italian prisoners were already there, their eyes wide, their usual boisterousness replaced by a stunned silence. Akiko stood frozen, her tray in her hands, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. This was not for the guards. This was for them, for the prisoners, for the enemy. An American officer, the same one with the tired eyes who had greeted them on their first day, stood at the head of the line with a large carving knife. He carved a thick slice of white turkey meat and placed it on the first prisoner's tray, offering a stiff, awkward smile and a mumbled, "Happy Thanksgiving." The prisoner, a young German boy who couldn't have been more than 18, stared at the meat and then at the officer, his face a canvas of disbelief. He stammered something in German, a danke, and moved down the line as if in a trance. One by one, the prisoners were served this incredible feast. They were given portions that were not just adequate, but generous, even celebratory. Akiko finally reached the serving station. The officer looked at her, his gaze professional, but not unkind. He placed a slice of turkey, a scoop of potatoes, and a spoonful of every side dish onto her tray. It was piled so high she could barely see over it. She looked down at the plate, at the sheer, unadulterated, impossible plenty of it all. And in that moment, something inside her, something that had been cracking and splintering for weeks, finally shattered completely. This was not an act of kindness. This was a weapon. It was the most brutal and effective weapon she had ever witnessed. It was a statement delivered not with bombs but with gravy, that said, "We can do this. We can fight a war on 2 fronts across 2 oceans and still have so much left over that we can afford to feed our captured enemies a feast on a random Thursday in November. We have so much that your entire nation's collected sacrifice and deprivation is meaningless to us. This is what you are fighting against. You are not fighting an army. You are fighting a force of nature." The taste of the turkey, when she finally brought it to her lips, was the taste of utter and absolute defeat. It was delicious. Your engagement helps us tell more stories like this. If you believe history is more than just dates and battles, hit the like button and subscribe for more explorations of the human side of war. The silence in the mess hall was profound. It was not the defiant silence of their first days in the camp, but a heavy, somber silence of revelation. The clinking of forks against metal trays was the only sound, a metallic counterpoint to the storm of thoughts raging inside each prisoner's mind. Akiko ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself to taste each new flavor. The sweetness of the yams, the tartness of the cranberries, the savory depth of the stuffing. It was a symphony of sensations her palate was utterly unprepared for. Each bite was an indictment of the world she had come from, a world of noble sacrifice that now seemed like nothing more than a grand, tragic exercise in managing scarcity. She watched her women. Their faces, once hard and impassive, were now unguarded, vulnerable. Some ate with a desperate, frantic hunger. Others, like her, ate with a slow, meditative gravity, as if performing a sacred rite. A few were crying silently, the tears tracing clean paths through the dust on their cheeks as they chewed. The most jarring part of the experience was the behavior of the Americans. They were not gloating. They were not standing over the prisoners with an air of smug superiority. In fact, they seemed almost embarrassed. The officers and guards who served the food did so with a kind of dutiful awkwardness, as if this was a strange and slightly uncomfortable chore they had been ordered to perform. After the prisoners were served, the guards filled their own trays from the same serving line and sat at their own tables, eating the same meal. There was no separation, no special victor's feast. For one afternoon, in this dusty corner of the Arizona desert, captors and captives were joined in the same peculiar ritual of consumption. This lack of malice was, in its own way, the cruelest blow. It denied them the dignity of being hated. Their enemy did not even see them as significant enough to despise. They were simply a logistical problem to be managed, and today's management plan called for a feast. As the meal concluded, a senior officer stood up and tapped a glass for attention. The Nisei interpreter stood beside him. The officer delivered a short, simple speech. He explained, in awkward, halting phrases, that Thanksgiving was a holiday about giving thanks for the harvest and the blessings of the past year. He said that even in a time of war, it was an American tradition to share what one had. He did not speak of victory or surrender or ideology. He spoke of food and family and a vague, generalized sense of gratitude. It was a speech so devoid of propaganda, so utterly mundane in its sentiment, that it was utterly disarming. It offered no philosophical battleground, no point of ideological contention. It was like being struck by a pillow. Akiko listened to the translated words, and for the first time she felt not anger, not defiance, not even shame, but a vast, hollow emptiness. How do you fight an enemy who celebrates a holiday by feeding you? How do you maintain your hatred for a people whose concept of power is so intertwined with generosity? The culmination of the day came with the pie. A slice of pumpkin pie was placed in front of each prisoner. It was a strange, orange-colored custard in a flaky crust, topped with a dollop of whipped cream. Akiko had never seen anything like it. She hesitantly took a bite. The flavor was alien, sweet, earthy, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. It was the taste of autumn, the taste of home, but a home she had never known. It was the taste of a different world, a different way of being. As she ate the pie, she looked across the hall and saw one of the American guards, a young man with freckles, watching her. He caught her eye, and instead of looking away, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod and a slight smile. It was not a smile of pity or of victory. It was a smile of simple, human connection, a gesture that said, "Yes, the pie is good, isn't it?" In that moment, the ideological war was over. It hadn't ended with a bang, or a heroic last stand, or a defiant cry. It had ended in a quiet mess hall with a slice of pie and an awkward smile. Her spirit, so carefully forged and sharpened for a battle of wills, had been met not with a counterforce, but with a soft, yielding abyss of comfort and decency that had simply absorbed her hatred and left nothing behind. She had been prepared to die for her emperor. She had not been prepared for pumpkin pie. The war had taught them how to die, but the Americans, with their casual kindness and baffling abundance, were teaching them something far more terrifying: how to live. This journey into the past is ongoing. To ensure you don't miss the final, transformative chapter of this story, make sure you are subscribed and have clicked the bell icon. The years after the war were a long, slow process of unlearning. For Akiko and the women of the Chrysanthemum Division who survived, repatriation was not a joyful homecoming, but a disorienting return to a world they no longer recognized. Their nation was a landscape of ruins, both physical and spiritual. The divine emperor had declared himself a man. The ideology they had been willing to die for had evaporated into a mist of shame and regret. They were ghosts in their own land, relics of a failed dream. They struggled to reconcile the Japan of their fanatical youth with the broken, occupied nation that was their new reality. But for Akiko, the most profound and lasting disorientation was not the sight of American soldiers patrolling the streets of Tokyo, but the memory of the POW camp in Arizona. That single Thanksgiving meal had become the defining moment of her war. It was a memory more vivid and more powerful than any battle, any loss, any moment of terror. It was the memory that had, in a single afternoon, dismantled her entire worldview. In the hungry, desperate years of post-war reconstruction, when food was scarce and the future uncertain, the memory of that feast became an almost sacred touchstone. It was a secret she held in her heart, a truth she could never fully explain to those who had not been there. How could she describe to her family, who were surviving on meager rations of rice and fish, that she, their enemy, had once eaten roasted turkey and pumpkin pie in the middle of the war? It was a story so absurd, so unbelievable, that it sounded like a traitor's fantasy. The experience created a permanent schism in her mind. She had seen the true source of American power. It wasn't their atomic bombs, their massive fleets, or their endless waves of soldiers. Those were merely the symptoms of the power, not the source. The source was a system, a culture, a way of life that could produce such staggering casual abundance that it could afford to be humane. It was a power that grew from the soil of 1,000 fertile farms, that was forged in the fire of 10,000 humming factories, that was organized by a logistical genius that could move mountains of food and supplies across a continent and an ocean, simply as a matter of routine. They had been fighting a spiritual war against a material giant, and they had mistaken the giant's kindness for weakness, when in fact it was the ultimate expression of its strength. Akiko lived a long life. She married, raised children, and watched Japan rise from its own ashes to become an economic powerhouse in its own right. she saw her own country learn to create the kind of abundance she had once found so shocking. And yet, she never forgot. The memory of the camp was not a source of bitterness, but of a profound and humbling wisdom. It taught her that ideologies are fragile things, that hatred is a luxury of the ignorant, and that the truth of a nation is found not in its propaganda, but in the food it serves its prisoners. She learned that a system that can afford to be generous is inherently stronger than one that must demand constant sacrifice. It was a hard lesson, a lesson that had cost her everything she once believed in, but it was the most important lesson of her life. Her grandchildren knew her as a quiet, gentle woman who was strangely insistent on celebrating Thanksgiving every November, a foreign holiday that had no roots in their culture. They would gather at her home, and she would prepare a meal of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie, her hands moving with the certainty of long practice. They never fully understood her obsession with this strange American tradition. They didn't know that with each slice of pie she served, she was paying homage to the moment her war had truly ended, not in the fury of battle, but in the quiet, devastatingly effective act of being fed by her enemy. It was her private memorial to the day she learned that the most powerful weapon in any nation's arsenal is not a sword, but a loaf of bread offered freely